On the morning of Friday, October 13, 1307, bells rang across France, but not for prayer. Before sunrise, royal guards moved in silence through cobbled streets, carrying sealed orders that would change history forever. By nightfall, hundreds of Knights Templar were arrested, accused of heresy, corruption, and crime so shocking they stunned medieval Europe. Official records insist this was a sudden purge, a perfectly timed strike ordered by King Philip V. Yet almost immediately, something refused to fit the story. The Knights Templar were not only warriors of the Crusades, they were bankers, ship owners, and masters of logistics, operating one of the most sophisticated networks the medieval world had ever seen. At the center of that network was their fleet, anchored primarily at the port of La Rochelle. According to royal documents, those ships should have been seized alongside the men. But when officials arrived, the harbor was empty. No battle was recorded. No chase followed. The fleet had vanished as if it had been warned. This single detail cracks the official narrative wide open. How could an order this secret fail at its most critical point? Who tipped them off? And how far in advance? Some historians argue coincidence or poor record keeping, but the silence remains impossible to ignore. Because if the Templars knew what was coming, the question changes completely. They were not victims of a surprise attack. They were executing an escape plan, and the reason still terrifies historians. What they carried remains the unanswered mystery. Medieval Europe was not a world of large navies or hidden armadas. Ships were expensive, slow to build, and carefully recorded by port authorities who taxed every mast and sail. That is what makes the Templar fleet so unsettling. Scattered port ledgers from France, Portugal, and the Mediterranean hint at something extraordinary. Dozens of ships moving under Templar authority, far more than an order of monks should have possessed. La Rochelle was only the beginning. Records from Marseille, Genoa, and even smaller coastal towns reference Templar vessels arriving without clear cargo descriptions, staying briefly, then departing under sealed orders. Some documents list hull numbers without destinations. Others record payments for crews who never officially disembarked. It is as if the ships were deliberately blurred from history. Historians often dismiss these anomalies as clerical errors, but the pattern repeats too consistently to ignore. The Templars were not behaving like pilgrims or soldiers. They were behaving like custodians, guarding something valuable enough to justify secrecy across multiple ports and kingdoms. Even more disturbing is what the records do not say. No inventory, no explanation, no trace of royal oversight. In an age obsessed with control, this absence feels intentional, and it leads to a chilling question. Fleets exist to transport something. If not armies or treasure, then what demanded such protection? Whatever the Templars were moving, it was important enough to vanish without a trace, and whoever they were protecting it from clearly held unimaginable power. Beyond the vanished ships lies another silence, deeper and far more controlled. Within the Vatican exist archives so restricted they are inaccessible even to most church scholars. Officially renamed the Apostolic Archives, their former title, the Vatican Secret Archives, was never accidental. Entire corridors of history are locked away, cataloged but unseen, guarded not by myth, but by policy. Researchers who have gained limited access describe shelves of medieval correspondence, trial transcripts, and inventories that abruptly end in the early 14th century. Lists begin, then stop. References appear without explanation. Mentions of objects are replaced with vague phrases like items removed for protection. It is this careful vagueness that unsettles historians the most. The trial of the Knights Templar is well documented in public records, Yet private Vatican inventories from the same period remain sealed. Scholars have asked for centuries what was separated from the official story. Why preserve some documents while hiding others indefinitely? The Church has never offered a complete answer. Silence, in this case, speaks loudly. Institutions do not hide trivial information for 700 years. They hide contradictions, they hide threats, and they hide knowledge capable of destabilizing belief itself. If the Templars carried something the Church could not destroy, perhaps the safest solution was to bury its existence entirely, leaving only questions behind. What remains sealed today suggests not forgotten history, but a deliberate pause, as if humanity itself was judged unready to confront what was written long ago then. A darker hypothesis begins to form when these fragments are placed together. Gold explains greed, but it does not explain terror. Kings do not burn men alive for money alone, and empires do not erase records to hide coins. Something else was at stake, something far older and far more dangerous. What if the Templars were not fleeing with treasure at all? What if their ships carried stone tablets etched thousands of years earlier, describing beings who descended from the sky and shaped humanity itself? Ancient Sumerian texts speak of the Anunnaki, gods who were not spirits, but visitors, teachers, and genetic architects. To medieval theologians, such claims were not merely heretical, they were catastrophic. If these tablets had surfaced beneath Jerusalem, beneath the ruins of Solomon's temple, the implications would have been unbearable. Creation would no longer begin. In Eden, God would no longer stand alone. Faith would fracture under the weight of a history older than Scripture. This hypothesis changes everything. It explains the urgency, the secrecy, and the silence that followed. It explains why the fleet vanished first, why records dissolved, and why questions were punished instead of answered. If the Templars carried proof that humanity's story had been rewritten once before, then perhaps they believed it would happen again. And perhaps the real mystery is not whether the tablets existed, but whether they are still moving through history, hidden, waiting for the moment they are meant to be found, when time itself decides humanity is ready. History remembers the Knights Templar as armored monks, sworn to poverty and trained for war, yet this image hides a quieter, more unsettling truth. The Templars were not only fighters on horseback, they were readers, translators, and collectors of knowledge in an age when books were rarer than gold. During the Crusades, while other orders focused on conquest, the Templars stayed behind, embedded in cities where civilizations overlapped. They interacted with Jewish scholars, Islamic mathematicians, and Eastern Christian mystics, absorbing texts that most Europeans had never seen. Ancient manuscripts passed through their hands, written in Greek, Arabic, Hebrew, and older tongues few could decipher. These were not devotional works alone, but treatises on astronomy, engineering, medicine, and forgotten histories. The Templars built libraries inside fortresses, guarded as fiercely as any treasury. Some chroniclers describe chests of scrolls transported alongside weapons, protected with equal urgency. This behavior makes little sense for a purely military order. But it makes perfect sense for archivists tasked with preserving something fragile and dangerous. Knowledge, once uncovered, cannot be buried easily. And the Templars seem to understand this. They were not amassing texts for curiosity. They were safeguarding them, as if aware that certain truths, once revealed, could unravel the fragile balance of medieval faith and power forever. Their very name hints at something deeper. The poor fellow soldiers of Christ were formerly known as the Order of the Temple of Solomon, because their headquarters stood directly above the ruins of Solomon's Temple in Jerusalem. This was no coincidence. Almost immediately after their arrival, the Templars began digging. Official church accounts claim these excavations were meant for stables and foundations, yet archaeological evidence suggests extensive tunneling beneath the Temple Mount. Ancient passages, sealed chambers, and forgotten vaults were explored in near total secrecy. For nearly a decade, the Templars operated below ground, away from prying eyes. Legends speak of discoveries that predated Judaism itself. Stone containers inscribed tablets, objects described not as sacred relics, but as records. If true, these findings would have belonged not to biblical history, but to something far older. Civilizations erased by time. The Temple Mount was believed to be the axis of creation, the point where heaven and earth once met. To uncover something there that contradicted Scripture would have been unthinkable. And yet the Templars stayed, digging patiently, as if they knew exactly what they were looking for. And once they found it, everything changed. The transformation of the Templars after Jerusalem was impossible to ignore. Within decades, they became the most powerful organization in Europe. Kings borrowed from them. Popes relied on them. Their financial system functioned like an early form of international banking, centuries ahead of its time. But wealth alone does not explain their technological advantages. Templar fortresses were architectural marvels designed with precision that baffled contemporary builders. Their understanding of geometry, navigation, and logistics seemed unnatural for the era. Some even whispered that they possessed advanced maps and measurements unknown to medieval science. This sudden leap raises a disturbing possibility. What if their power did not come from commerce, but from knowledge extracted from ancient sources? Knowledge that revealed forgotten principles of the natural world, knowledge that could be applied quietly, without explanation. Europe watched the Templars grow stronger, richer, and more secretive, and fear followed admiration. Because power that cannot be explained invites suspicion, especially when it does not ask permission. The Church tolerated many things, but not challenges to its authority over truth itself. As whispers about the Templars spread, accusations shifted from financial misconduct to spiritual corruption. They were no longer accused of greed, but of knowing too much. Suddenly, rumors emerged of secret rituals, strange symbols, and forbidden teachings passed only among initiates. Whether true or fabricated, they served a purpose. They reframed the Templars not as rivals, but as heretics. This is where the story turns lethal. Knowledge that empowers can also condemn. If the Templars possessed truths that contradicted doctrine, then negotiation was impossible. Such knowledge could not be debated. It had to be erased. Their secrecy deepened. Their movements became guarded. And when the arrests came, they came with a ferocity that suggested panic, not justice. Men were tortured not for confession alone, but for information, something specific, something unseen. Because when an institution built on belief encounters proof that belief is incomplete, the response is never gentle. It is final. Long before Egypt raised its pyramids or the Bible recorded its earliest stories, a civilization appeared in the land between two rivers. Sumer did not evolve slowly from primitive beginnings. It emerged abruptly, already complex, organized, and astonishingly advanced. Archaeologists still struggle to explain how a society could rise so suddenly with no clear developmental trail behind it. The Sumerians possessed writing from the very start. Their cuneiform tablets recorded laws, contracts, prayers, star charts, and mathematical formulas. They divided time into hours, minutes, and seconds, a system the modern world still uses without question. Their legal codes predate Moses by centuries. Their cities were carefully planned, their agriculture sophisticated, their bureaucracy precise. What unsettles historians is not just what the Sumerians knew, but how early they knew it. There are no crude experimental phases, no rough drafts of civilization. Sumer arrives fully formed, as if knowledge had been delivered rather than discovered. Mainstream history explains this as coincidence or lost predecessors, yet no evidence of such precursor cultures exists. Instead, Sumer stands alone at the beginning of recorded history, already gazing toward the heavens, already measuring the world with confidence. This is where the mystery deepens, because civilizations do not appear overnight unless they are taught, and the Sumerians themselves claimed they were. Their texts insist that their knowledge came from beings older than humanity, beings who descended from the sky and reshaped the fate of mankind forever. The Sumerian tablets speak openly about the Anunnaki, a group of powerful beings described not as spirits, but as flesh and blood entities who arrived from the heavens. Their name translates roughly to those who came from the sky to earth. These were not distant gods. They walked among humans, ruled cities, and issued commands. According to the texts, the Anunnaki were creators, judges, and engineers. They possessed flying craft, controlled natural forces, and lived for thousands of years. Humanity was not their equal. Humans were workers, servants, and eventually experiments. This is written not as metaphor, but as record. Kingship, the tablets say, did not originate with humans. It descended from the heavens. Civilization itself was a gift, or perhaps a tool, imposed by these beings to manage a growing population. The Anunnaki are described arguing among themselves, fighting wars, and making decisions that altered Earth's future. What makes these stories disturbing is their consistency. Across hundreds of tablets written across centuries, the narrative remains stable. The same names, the same roles, the same celestial origins to a medieval church built on spiritual creation. Such accounts would have been unthinkable. Gods who bleed, creators who are not eternal, beings who arrive rather than exist forever. These were not stories of faith. They were stories of origin that replaced God with visitors. Hidden within the mythological language of the tablets are references that modern scholars find deeply uncomfortable. The Sumerians described the solar system with surprising accuracy, listing planets invisible to the naked eye and placing them in correct order. They recorded long astronomical cycles that repeat over tens of thousands of years. Some texts describe the creation of humans using language that resembles genetic manipulation rather than divine breath. Humans are shaped, altered, and perfected through repeated attempts. Failures are mentioned, adjustments are made, the tone is procedural, not poetic. Even more unsettling are references to Earth before humanity, to ages defined by cosmic events rather than human history. The tablets speak of resets, floods, and interventions triggered by celestial mechanics. This implies a long-term observational understanding of planetary science far beyond ancient capability. Mainstream scholars argue symbolism, but the precision challenges that comfort. Symbols do not calculate orbital cycles. Myths do not preserve consistent astronomical data across generations. If this knowledge truly existed thousands of years ago, then it had to come from somewhere else. And if the Templars encountered these texts, they would have recognized immediately how dangerous they were, because they suggested humanity's greatest achievements were inherited, not earned. At the heart of this mystery lies a question no institution wants asked. What if creation did not begin with God speaking into darkness, but with beings arriving from the sky? What if Adam was not the first, but the final version? What if humanity was designed, not divinely formed? For the medieval church, such ideas were not theological debates. They were existential threats. Authority rested on the belief that God alone created man, that Scripture was the first and final truth. The Sumerian tablet shattered that certainty by placing humanity inside a much older, much larger story. If God was not the beginning, then doctrine collapsed. If angels were misunderstood visitors, then heaven itself required reinterpretation. Faith could not survive competition with evidence. This explains the fear. This explains the secrecy. Texts like these could not be refuted easily. They had to be hidden, dismissed, or destroyed. And if destruction was impossible, silence became the only weapon. If the Templars carried these tablets across seas, then they carried more than stone. They carried the power to rewrite humanity's origin story. And that is a burden no empire willingly allows to exist in the open. Beneath the polished halls and sacred chambers of Vatican City lies a world few have seen, and even fewer have described openly. Beyond the official apostolic archives, beyond the catalog shelves shown to approved scholars, there are whispers of deeper vaults, underground chambers that do not appear on any public map, rooms that exist outside normal documentation, spoken of only in fragments and secondhand testimony. Former Vatican staff and researchers have hinted at sealed staircases, restricted elevators, and corridors requiring permissions that override academic credentials entirely. These spaces are not simply locked, they are omitted. Their absence is deliberate, as if acknowledging them would raise questions the church does not wish to answer. According to these accounts, certain collections were separated long ago, removed from standard archival systems, and placed under direct ecclesiastical control. They are not forgotten relics, but curated silences. Each document inside was judged not by age or fragility, but by impact. The idea of an archive beneath the archive unsettles historians because it suggests a hierarchy of truth. Some knowledge is preserved for study. Other knowledge is preserved only to remain unseen. And if such chambers exist, their purpose is clear. They are not libraries. They are vaults, built not to share history, but to contain it quietly, patiently, until the world outside forgets to ask what lies below. 4.2 Documents no scholar can access. For centuries, scholars have petitioned the Vatican for access to its medieval records, believing transparency would arrive with time. Yet, even today, approval does not guarantee understanding. Researchers describe reaching invisible walls within the archive, where documents suddenly become unavailable without explanation. Requests involving the Knights Templar are especially fraught. Entire categories of files are labeled restricted not for preservation, but for reasons never disclosed. Scholars are redirected, citations disappear. Files are acknowledged in one index but absent in another. It is an administrative maze designed to exhaust curiosity. What troubles historians most is that these blocks do not follow a consistent rule. Some Templar trial records are public. Others, from the same year and location, remain sealed. The pattern suggests selection, not policy. Someone decided what could be known. This selective openness creates suspicion. Institutions that fear nothing do not curate access so carefully. They release, contextualize, and defend. The Vatican instead deflects It allows fragments of the story to surface while guarding the core. The question is not whether documents exist, it is why, after 7 centuries, the Church still believes certain texts cannot be read. What threat could parchment pose in a modern world unless the ideas written on it remain just as dangerous as they were long ago? 443. Missing years in church history. When historians piece together the timeline of early medieval Europe, they encounter an unsettling phenomenon. Entire decades seem to vanish. Correspondence ends abruptly. Records skip forward without explanation. Events referenced later have no surviving documentation from their own time. These gaps are not isolated. They cluster around moments of upheaval, especially the early 14th century. The fall of the Templars, the consolidation of papal power, and the reorganization of church authority all sit beside missing years that cannot be fully reconstructed. Official explanations cite war, fire, or decay. Yet this reasoning fails under scrutiny. The Church preserved documents meticulously, even during chaos. The absence feels intentional, as if history itself was edited. Missing years create room for revision. They allow narratives to be rewritten without contradiction. When primary sources vanish, interpretation becomes authority, and authority can shape memory. If documents from these lost decades describe discoveries that challenged doctrine, their removal would not erase the truth entirely, but it would delay it. Silence becomes a tool stretching across generations. Over time, questions lose urgency. Curiosity fades, but absence leaves an imprint. These missing years stand like shadows in the historical record, marking where something happened that could not be allowed to remain. Those who probe these shadows often pay a price. Academic history is built on reputation, funding, and institutional trust. When a scholar challenges boundaries too forcefully, access quietly disappears. Grants vanish, invitations stop arriving, careers stall without explanation. There are documented cases of researchers who focused on forbidden intersections of Templar history, ancient texts, and church archives, only to find themselves marginalized, their work labeled speculative, their credibility questioned not through debate, but through silence. Some abandoned their research, others persisted publishing independently, only to be dismissed as fringe voices. The pattern is subtle but consistent. Ask the wrong questions long enough, and the system corrects itself. This modern consequence mirrors the medieval one. While no one is burned today, exclusion achieves the same effect. It discourages inquiry without drawing attention. The message is clear across centuries. There are limits to acceptable curiosity. Some doors are meant to remain closed, not because what lies behind them is false, but because it is powerful. And power, once uncovered, cannot be controlled. That is why the vaults endure. That is why the silence remains locked. In the days leading up to October 13th, 1307, the world moved as if nothing extraordinary was about to happen. Markets opened, monks prayed, kings planned. Yet, along the western coast of France, something quiet and deliberate was unfolding. At the Templar-controlled port of La Rochelle, ships were being prepared with unusual urgency. Crews were assembled, supplies were loaded, orders were given. Without written explanation, the timing is impossible to ignore. Royal arrest warrants were already sealed, destined for delivery across the kingdom. Someone knew. Someone had warned them. When royal agents finally arrived at La Rochelle, they found empty docks and unanswered questions. The Templar fleet, long established and meticulously maintained, had vanished. Contemporary chronicles mention no pursuit, no naval engagement, No storms to explain the disappearance. Ships do not simply dissolve into the sea, especially not an organized fleet capable of long-distance travel. The silence that follows suggests planning rather than panic. What makes this moment so unsettling is its precision. The fleet did not scatter randomly. It departed as a unit, as if following a prearranged route known only to its commanders. This was not escape born of fear. It was execution of a contingency. From that moment on, the Templar ships slipped into legend. No confirmed sightings, no recovered wreckage, only fragments of records hinting that something monumental left Europe just before history closed its fist around the order. And whatever sailed away that night was never meant to return. Beyond La Rochelle, the mystery deepens across the Mediterranean. Port records from the early 14th century reveal strange inconsistencies. Ships bearing Templar insignia are logged as arriving in key harbors, only to vanish from subsequent entries. They appear on one page and are absent on the next, as if erased mid-journey. In Marseille, a vessel is recorded docking briefly, taking on water and provisions. No cargo is listed, no destination is recorded. In Genoa, a similar entry appears, followed by nothing. Clerks who meticulously documented trade somehow forgot to note departures. This pattern repeats across coastal Europe. Historians have struggled to explain this phenomenon. Clerical error can account for one anomaly, perhaps two, but repeated silence across independent ports suggests coordination. Someone wanted these movements recorded partially, but never fully traced. Ports were places of oversight and taxation. To pass through without scrutiny required influence, secrecy, or both. The Templars possessed networks that transcended borders, allowing ships to move where others could not. These ports of silence function like missing frames in a film. The story advances, but critical moments are gone. What happened between arrival and disappearance remains unknown, yet the consistency implies intent. These ships were not lost. They were deliberately untracked, and history was instructed to look away. Perhaps the most unsettling detail lies in the cargo records themselves. Medieval shipping manifests were precise, especially for valuable goods. Gold, relics, grain, and weapons were always listed, taxed, and insured. But the Templar manifests from this period break every rule. Some list weight without material. Others reference sealed chests with no description. A few avoid cargo entirely, noting only items under command. Such language is extraordinary for an era obsessed with documentation. It suggests objects that could not be named safely. Gold invites theft. Relics invite reverence. But unnamed cargo invites fear. Whatever these ships carried was not meant to be inspected, discussed, or recorded. It traveled under authority rather than explanation. If the Templars were moving ancient artifacts or texts, anonymity would have been essential. Naming invites questions. Questions invite attention. And attention was precisely what they were avoiding. The absence of inventory tells its own story. These were not commercial voyages. They were custodial missions. Something fragile, irreplaceable, and dangerous was being transported across hostile waters. Something worth risking everything to protect. When records fall silent, imagination rushes in. But sometimes silence itself is evidence. And in this case, the silence surrounding the cargo is louder than any declaration of gold ever could be. With no confirmed destination, speculation becomes inevitable. Some theories point north towards Scotland, a land hostile to the French crown and rumored to shelter fleeing Templars. Ancient churches bearing strange symbols fuel this belief, as do legends of knights arriving by sea under cover of night. Others look west to Portugal, where the Templars were quietly absorbed into a new order, protected by royal decree. Portuguese ports offered safety, secrecy, and access to open ocean routes beyond Mediterranean oversight. But the most unsettling theories look farther still, beyond known trade routes, beyond medieval maps. Some suggest the fleet crossed into lands Europe had not officially discovered, lands that existed in whispered knowledge and forbidden charts. If the Templars possessed advanced navigation or ancient maps, such a journey would not be impossible. It would be intentional. A final hiding place beyond reach of kings and popes. Wherever they went, the destination served one purpose: disappearance. Not destruction, but removal from history's grasp. And if they succeeded, then the fleet did not vanish. It completed its mission. The real question is not where the ships went, but what they ensured would survive long after the world that chased them collapsed into memory. In 1513, an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis compiled a map that should have been impossible. Drawn centuries before Antarctica was officially discovered, it depicted a southern landmass with an ice-free coastline, accurate mountain ranges, and precise proportions. When modern scientists compared it to seismic scans beneath Antarctic ice, the resemblance was deeply unsettling. Piri Reis himself admitted the map was not original. He claimed it was copied from much older sources, some dating back to the time of Alexander the Great, others even earlier. These source maps no longer exist, yet their accuracy suggests advanced surveying techniques unknown to the medieval world. Antarctica has been covered in ice for at least 6,000 years. Mapping it without ice implies either access to ancient pre-glacial knowledge or technology capable of seeing beneath kilometers of frozen surface. Neither explanation fits accepted history. The question becomes unavoidable. Who possessed this knowledge and how did it survive? If such maps existed long before modern exploration, they had to be preserved, protected, and passed along in secret. The Piri Reis map is not just a cartographic curiosity. It is a crack in the timeline, a suggestion that humanity once knew far more about its planet than it remembers. And if the Templars had access to ancient archives, then maps like this may not have been rediscovered accidentally. They may have been safeguarded, waiting for the right moment to surface. Latitude can be measured by the stars, but longitude requires precise timekeeping. This was considered impossible before the invention of accurate marine chronometers in the 18th century. Yet medieval maps display longitudinal accuracy that defies this limitation. Some portolan charts from the 14th and 15th centuries show coastlines with near-perfect proportional distances. Islands appear exactly where they should, despite sailors lacking the tools to measure east-west positioning reliably. Scholars have long dismissed this as coincidence or gradual correction, but the math refuses to cooperate. Accuracy on this scale suggests either lost technology or inherited data, maps copied from older originals rather than created through trial and error. The consistency across different regions implies a common source. If such knowledge existed, it was not widely shared. It was controlled, passed selectively among those trusted to understand its value. The Templars, with their international network and secrecy, fit this role perfectly. Advanced navigation would have allowed them to travel beyond known boundaries to sail routes so others could not replicate. It would explain how fleets vanished without trace. They were not lost. They were invisible to those without the map. Longitude, before longitude, is not just an anomaly. It is evidence of a forgotten science, one that survived quietly while history pretended it never existed. As researchers examined early maps more closely, they noticed something stranger still. Embedded within decorative elements and compass roses were symbols resembling known Templar iconography: the red cross, the eight-pointed star, marks associated with initiation rather than navigation. These symbols were subtle, easily dismissed as artistic flair, yet their placement was deliberate, often appearing near unexplored regions or ambiguous coastlines, almost like markers, signaling importance to those who knew how to read them. Some maps contained geometric patterns consistent with sacred architecture used by the Templars in Europe, ratios, angles, and alignments that mirrored cathedral designs rather than cartographic necessity. This blending of map making and symbolism suggests layered meaning. To the uninitiated, these charts were maps. To the informed, they were messages. Directions hidden in plain sight, the presence of Templar symbols on charts created after the Order's official destruction raises disturbing questions. How did these markings survive? Who preserved the knowledge? And why embed it so carefully? It implies continuity, a lineage of custodians who outlived persecution and carried secrets forward. If the Templars vanished as an organization, their knowledge did not vanish with them. It was encoded, protected, and allowed to drift through history disguised as art. When these fragments are assembled, a new interpretation emerges. These maps were not discoveries made by explorers. They were directions left behind, instructions for those who knew where to look and how to read. Rather than charting unknown lands, they preserved paths already traveled, routes tested long before official exploration narratives began. This would explain why some coastlines appear accurate before any recorded voyages. A route meant to stay secret would need protection across generations. It would need symbols instead of labels, silence instead of explanation, and above all, it would need trusted guardians. If the Templars carried ancient tablets, maps would be essential, not to explore, but to relocate, to ensure survival of knowledge beyond political reach. These charts could guide future custodians to hidden repositories far from scrutiny. The greatest deception in history may not be false maps, but true ones, presented as fantasy. While the world debated their authenticity, the roots remained intact, and if these maps still exist, then the path has already been drawn. The question is not whether the destination is real, but whether anyone today still knows how to follow it. Scattered across the Americas are stone structures that quietly resist explanation. Massive blocks fitted without mortar, precise alignments to solstices, and architectural techniques that mirror old world traditions rather than local evolution. Official history assigns these constructions to indigenous ingenuity, yet some details refuse to align. In parts of North America, megalithic sites display corbelled arches and stonework methods strikingly similar to those used in Europe and the Near East. The stones are shaped, balanced, and positioned with a mathematical confidence that suggests inherited knowledge rather than isolated invention. Even more unsettling are carvings that resemble European symbols rather than indigenous iconography. Critics argue coincidence or independent development, but the repetition of specific techniques across oceans strains that comfort. Civilizations separated by thousands of miles somehow solve the same engineering problems in the same way, down to proportions and angles. If these structures predate Columbus, then someone arrived earlier, someone with architectural memory. The stones themselves do not speak, but their silence invites a dangerous question. Were these monuments the fingerprints of visitors who crossed the ocean long before history says they could? Beyond architecture, symbols tell a quieter but more revealing story. Carvings found on stone walls, cave entrances, and isolated boulders bear uncanny resemblance to markings from the Old World, crosses predating Christianity, geometric patterns matching Near Eastern sacred designs, even symbols resembling early cuneiform strokes. Some researchers have documented carvings that mirror Templar insignia in both form and placement. These are not decorative. They appear at thresholds, entrances, and high vantage points, locations associated with guardianship rather than art. The probability of such similarities occurring independently, repeatedly across continents, is vanishingly small. Symbols carry meaning, and meaning is taught. It travels with people. If the Templar fleet reached distant shores, these symbols could serve as markers, signals to future arrivals, or warnings to those who did not belong. Mainstream archaeology dismisses these findings as misinterpretation, but dismissal is easier than explanation. Symbols crossing oceans suggest continuity of culture, not isolated invention. They suggest that the sea was not a barrier, but a bridge, quietly crossed long before anyone was supposed to know how. Long before European chroniclers arrived, indigenous communities preserved their histories through stories rather than ink. Many of these oral traditions speak of strange visitors arriving from the sea, pale-skinned men with beards, figures dressed in metal, carriers of sacred objects and forbidden knowledge. These visitors are often described not as conquerors, but as transient figures. They arrived, taught, built, and left. Some legends describe them as gods, others describe them as messengers fleeing catastrophe elsewhere. What is striking is the consistency. From North America to Mesoamerica, stories repeat similar motifs: boats with wings, objects that glowed, knowledge that changed societies, and then disappearance. European historians largely ignored these accounts, labeling them myth, but myths often preserve truth in symbolic forms. When multiple cultures describe similar encounters, the question shifts from belief to pattern. If these stories reflect real events, then history began earlier than acknowledged, and those who arrived did not come to rule. They came to hide, to protect, and to ensure something survived beyond the reach of the world they left behind. If the Templars crossed the ocean, their purpose was not settlement. They did not establish kingdoms or write chronicles. Their silence was intentional. And this suggests their mission was temporary and precise. They may have deposited knowledge in places difficult to access, encoded within stone, myth, and geography. Or they may have hidden physical objects, tablets or relics meant to remain undiscovered until a distant future. Another possibility is more unsettling. Perhaps they found something already waiting. Ancient sites older than humanity itself. Places chosen long before Europe rose or fell. Whatever they left behind was not meant to be reclaimed easily. Secrecy was the protection. Distance was the lock. The Templars understood something fundamental. Knowledge revealed too early destroys itself. By hiding it across oceans, beyond political and religious reach, they ensured survival at the cost of obscurity. The true tragedy may not be that we lost this knowledge, but that it was hidden so well that we no longer recognize the signs left behind, standing in stone, waiting for eyes trained to see beyond accepted history. Modern science prides itself on explaining where humanity came from, yet when geneticists examine our DNA closely, they encounter anomalies that refuse to fit neatly into evolutionary timelines. The human genome shows sudden leaps in complexity, moments where traits appear rapidly rather than gradually. These jumps challenge the slow incremental model Darwin proposed. One of the most debated mysteries is the emergence of advanced cognitive ability. Somewhere in our past, the human brain expanded and reorganized at a pace unmatched in the animal kingdom. Language, abstract thought, and self-awareness appeared almost simultaneously. There is no clear fossil trail showing this transformation step by step. Even more troubling are segments of human DNA that seem dormant yet highly organized, often called junk DNA. Scientists cannot agree on their purpose, but their structure suggests intention rather than randomness. Evolution usually trims excess. It does not preserve elaborate code without function. To many researchers, these questions are academic puzzles. To others, they hint at intervention. Something accelerated human development. Something altered the path nature would normally take. If ancient civilizations spoke of beings who shaped humanity deliberately, genetics may be echoing the same story through chemistry instead of myth, and that possibility forces us to reconsider whether we are purely the product of chance or the result of a decision made long before history began. The Sumerian tablets describe humanity's creation in unsettling detail. Humans are formed not through divine breath, but through process, mixing substances, adjusting forms, repeating failures until a stable result is achieved. This language does not resemble poetry, it resembles experimentation. According to these texts, humans were created to serve a function, to labor, to sustain the creators. Intelligence was added gradually, carefully balanced to ensure obedience without rebellion. These are not the actions of spiritual gods, but of engineers. This implication is dark, not because it denies meaning, but because it reframes it. Humanity becomes a project, not a miracle. Purpose becomes assigned, not discovered. Such ideas challenge the comforting belief that humans are the center of creation. Instead, they suggest we are a byproduct of another civilization's needs, designed, modified, and released into the world with limited awareness of our origins. If the Templars encountered these tablets, they would have understood the danger immediately. This knowledge does not simply rewrite history, it rewrites identity. It asks whether free will itself was ever fully ours. Once such a thought takes root, it cannot be easily erased, and that is why the tablets were feared, because they do not offer hope or doom. They offer explanation, and explanation is the most destabilizing force of all. Organized religion rests on a foundation of divine uniqueness. God creates humanity alone, intentionally, and with purpose defined by Scripture. The Anunnaki narrative fractures this foundation at every point. If humans were engineered, then creation is no longer sacred in the same way. If gods were physical beings, then miracles become technology misunderstood. Angels become visitors. Heaven becomes a place rather than a realm. Faith depends on mystery, but it also depends on trust. Trust that the story told is the beginning. The Sumerian tablets suggest it was not. This does not merely threaten theology, it threatens authority. Religious institutions derive power from interpreting divine will. If that will is replaced by ancient records and physical evidence, interpretation loses control. The church has survived heresies, schisms, and reformations. But proof of pre-biblical creators would be different. It would not argue doctrine, it would bypass it entirely. That is why such texts could never be debated openly. Debate invites curiosity. Curiosity invites verification. and verification would force faith to compete with evidence. In that contest, belief does not vanish, but it changes forever. And institutions built on certainty rarely survive transformation intact. There is a final, more unsettling possibility. Perhaps this knowledge was hidden not only by institutions, but by those who created it. The tablets themselves speak of cycles, resets, and deliberate forgetting, as if humanity was not meant to remember everything at once. Knowledge changes behavior. Identity reshapes destiny. If humans learn their origins too early, the consequences could be catastrophic. Rebellion, despair, or the loss of meaning altogether. The Templars may have understood this risk. By hiding the tablets, by scattering clues instead of revelations, they allowed humanity to mature without confronting its deepest truth prematurely. This suggests a long game, one measured in centuries rather than years, knowledge preserved but delayed, protected but inaccessible. If so, then the greatest secret is not that the truth was hidden, but that it may have been hidden for our own survival. The question becomes painfully simple. Are we finally ready to know who we are? Or was the truth meant to remain buried until a future humanity, wiser and more stable, could face it without destroying itself? When the Knights Templar were dragged before inquisitors, the outcome had already been decided. Confessions were not sought to discover truth, but to manufacture it. Under torture, men confessed to spitting on crosses, worshiping idols, and denying Christ. Yet buried within these forced admissions are contradictions that refuse to disappear. Many confessions were retracted the moment torture stopped. Others varied wildly from region to region, suggesting invention rather than shared ritual. Some knights described ceremonies that made no theological sense, as if interrogators themselves did not fully understand what they were accusing. More unsettling are moments where knights insist they were ordered to deny symbols, not beliefs, to reject images, not God. This distinction is subtle but critical. It hints at knowledge rather than heresy, at an understanding that symbols had been misused or misunderstood. In several transcripts, interrogators ask strangely specific questions, probing for information rather than guilt, questions about hidden objects, about texts, about locations. This was not a trial of faith. It was a search operation disguised as justice. The trials read less like prosecutions and more like interrogations of custodians who refused to surrender something never named, but desperately sought, and the fact that it was never recovered may explain why the punishment was so absolute. The public burnings of Templars were meant to send a message. Flames consumed bodies, but they also consumed memory. Fire destroys evidence, frightens witnesses, and ends debate. In medieval Europe, burning was reserved not for criminals, but for ideas deemed contagious. What if the executions served a second purpose, not only to eliminate men, but to symbolically destroy what they represented? Knowledge that could not be retrieved was at least erased from its guardians. Libraries were confiscated, property seized, records rewritten. Anything associated with the order was either absorbed or destroyed. Even the Templar name was forbidden, spoken only in condemnation. Fire has always been history's most efficient editor. It leaves no footnotes, no margins, just ash. The church and crown may not have known exactly what the Templars protected, but they understood enough to fear it. By burning the knights publicly, they burned the idea that such knowledge could exist outside approved doctrine. Yet fire has limits. It destroys paper and flesh, but it cannot burn what has already been moved. If the most dangerous knowledge escaped with the fleet, then the executions were an admission of failure disguised as triumph. Almost immediately after the purge, the official story solidified. If the Templars were declared corrupt, their fall was portrayed as necessary. Chronicles aligned. Doubt was erased through repetition. Within a generation, the order's legacy was reduced to cautionary tale: greed, pride, and secret sin. The complexity vanished. What remained was simple and safe. This rapid narrative shift is itself suspicious. History usually fractures after trauma, filled with conflicting accounts. In this case, it hardened. Uniformity replaced debate. Documents that challenged the narrative disappeared. Alternative explanations were never recorded. Silence was institutionalized. By controlling the story, authorities controlled memory, and memory defines reality. What was lost was not just the Templars' reputation, but the context of their existence, their discoveries, their purpose. Their end became a moral lesson rather than a mystery. When history is rewritten in real time, it leaves scars, gaps, questions that surface centuries later when the urgency to suppress has faded, but the truth still refuses to stay buried. Despite the brutality of the purge, not all Templars were captured. Some vanished before arrests began. Others escaped during the chaos that followed. Their fates were never recorded officially. Whispers suggest these survivors blended into other orders, fled to remote regions, or lived under new names. In Portugal, former Templars were quietly absorbed into the Order of Christ. In Scotland, legends speak of knights who fought at Bannockburn under unfamiliar banners. If these men carried secrets, survival would have required silence. Knowledge passed orally, symbols encoded, trust given sparingly. These survivors did not rebuild the order. They preserved something more important: continuity. The shadows they entered were not defeat, they were strategy, a way to outlast persecution by becoming invisible. If the Templars' greatest asset was knowledge, then survival meant ensuring that knowledge endured even if their name did not. And if that knowledge still exists, then it has traveled quietly through centuries, carried by those who understood that the most powerful truths are not defended with swords, but with patience. Imagine a moment when the tablets surface, authenticated beyond doubt, their translations verified by scholars across disciplines. In that instant, history fractures. The human story no longer begins with scripture or cave paintings, but with intervention. Civilization is no longer a slow ascent from ignorance, but a guided emergence shaped by forces older than memory. A religion would not disappear, but it would splinter. Some would reinterpret God as creator of the creators. Others would reject faith entirely, unable to reconcile belief with evidence. Identity itself would shift. Humanity would no longer see itself as unique, but as part of a broader cosmic narrative. Nations would argue over ownership of the truth. Who controls the tablets controls the story of humanity. Laws, ethics, and purpose would require rewriting. Education would change. Childhood would change. The question, why are we here, would finally have an answer. And that answer would be unsettling. This is why the idea feels dangerous. Truth does not arrive gently. It rearranges everything it touches. If the tablets exist, their revelation would not simply add knowledge. It would erase certainty. And the world that emerged afterward would not resemble the one that came before. Despite centuries of silence, there are signs. The secret never vanished. Classified documents remain sealed without clear justification. Archaeological discoveries are quietly reclassified or left unexplored. Researchers encounter sudden resistance when approaching certain subjects. Whistleblowers speak of files that cannot be released, not for national security, but for cultural stability. Governments deny interest too quickly. Institutions refuse questions too firmly. These reactions suggest not ignorance, but caution. Technology has advanced, yet curiosity remains restricted. Some discoveries are announced loudly, others are buried under administrative language and forgotten. Even the Vatican, now more open than ever, still withholds specific collections indefinitely. Silence persists where transparency would cost nothing. These are not coincidences, they are patterns. Patterns of control rather than confusion. If the tablets survived once, they could survive again. Knowledge does not vanish easily. It hides, waiting for conditions to change. The modern world may believe itself enlightened, but enlightenment does not guarantee readiness. Sometimes it only sharpens the fear of what might be revealed. Humanity struggles, even with small truths. We fracture over history, belief, and identity. The revelation of engineered origins would not unify us, it would destabilize us. Meaning is fragile. Many rely on faith, tradition, or national identity to navigate existence. Remove those anchors too quickly, and chaos follows. Depression, nihilism, and conflict would surge. The knowledge that humanity was created for a purpose, not our own, raises uncomfortable questions. Are we free? Were we ever? Such questions can liberate, but they can also destroy. Perhaps this is why the truth has been delayed, not suppressed out of malice, but postponed out of caution. Knowledge is power, but power without maturity is dangerous. Civilizations collapse when they learn too much too fast. History offers countless examples. If the Templars understood this, their decision to hide rather than reveal becomes less sinister and more responsible. Protection does not always mean control. Sometimes it means waiting. So the story ends where it began, with a question rather than an answer. What if the tablets were never lost? What if they were deliberately placed beyond reach, preserved rather than destroyed? Perhaps they rest in stone chambers protected by geography and silence. Perhaps they exist as copies encoded across cultures, myths, and symbols. Or perhaps they are held in vaults whose doors have never truly closed. Waiting implies intention. It implies a future moment when humanity reaches a threshold of understanding and stability. If that moment has not arrived, the silence makes sense. The final mystery is not about gods or knights or fleets. It is about us, our readiness, our responsibility. Because if the tablets are waiting, they are not waiting to be found. They are waiting for humanity to become something capable of surviving the truth. And when that day comes, history will not be rewritten. It will finally be remembered.